What does equality mean to me? What a big question. Well, for me, equality for women means the full opportunity to participate in civic and political life. It means equal access to resources, it means freedom from violence, and it means the power to control women's own reproductive capacity. And I think if we have all of those things, we'll be moving towards an Australia where women truly are equal.
Annabelle, good morning. Annabelle
Good
Daniels,
morning,
CEO
Jeremy.
of Women's Community Shelters. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's such a interesting and critical time, not only in the history of your work, but as we lead into International Women's Day, with all that seems to have, at least momentarily, eclipsed what is the most prevalent and persistent human rights abuse in the world, which is violence against women. Understandably, COVID was an enormous event globally, and yet here we are once again leading into another International Women's Day where the issues are as stark and relevant as they ever have been. I just want to note, because you shared with us before, that you've just reached 10 years in the role as CEO for Women's Community Shelters. Could you talk to us about the evolution of your journey in Women's Community Shelters and what it means to you to now be at this milestone?
Oh, wow. Well, what a reflection. It's a really, I feel very honoured to be at a place where, where I can count 10 years of work of women's community shelters. And look, the story actually began in 2011 with a founding board, and a couple of members of that board had moved into the Manly area and worked to establish a local shelter after noticing a need and noticing that the local community had actually been asking for a shelter for 20 years and there'd been no response from any level of government. And by pulling together as a community, they were able to establish a shelter in that local area, which provided support for up to 50 women a year who were leaving homelessness or domestic violence, and brought in fantastic community participation. And some of the establishers of that shelter thought that this was a great way of getting communities involved, not just in solving a problem, but in increasing community capacity to understand the issues. And so they created the entity that was Women's Community Shelters. And so in 2013, they asked me to come on board as the inaugural CEO. And at that time, 10 years ago, I sat down at a borrowed desk with a phone in the offices of the Big Issue at Redfern next to the station. And that's where the Women's Community Shelters journey began. And so it was me, myself and I for the first couple of years. And over the years, I've been joined by a crew of absolutely amazing women. And yesterday we had our team planning day for the year. And I felt really privileged to sit there and look at 20 women around the table who are supporting not just the development work we do with new communities, but our existing network of 9 shelters and up to 25 transitional houses at any one time. So that's a lovely point of reflection for me after 10 years.
And something to obviously feel very, very proud of. If we were to go back a little further in time, I'd love to explore where this passion for social justice came from. Often for some people working in this sector, it's a moment that changed their life, or it could be a series of moments where they were left with that knowing that this will then define the rest of their life. What was it for you?
Look, that's a really interesting question. And I think it's funny, when I reflect on my career journey now, it all seems to have pointed in this direction in a really logical way. But of course, it doesn't feel like that when you're walking through it at the time. And I think for me as a kid, if you'd asked me when I was 8 who I wanted to be when I grew up, the answer probably would have been Luke Skywalker. I was always kind of attracted to that notion of fighting for the good, with a lightsaber or a sword of justice in my hand, and the acknowledgement that there were forces in the world that worked against good for people, and that I wanted to be on the side of addressing those. You know, as I say now, bending the arc of the universe towards justice, one tiny little nanometer at a time. And so for me, that was always a driver. As I grew up, I went through a whole bunch of professions that I thought I might want to do before landing on lawyer, because my best friend at high school was doing it, and I thought that was a good idea. And I exited into commercial law from law school because that was a measure of success at the time, and very quickly found I was a square peg in a round hole. I'd always enjoyed the social justice subjects that I'd done at university. And so it took me a few years to find my feet. But when I joined the federal public service, I was working in and around issues of women and children, separation of families, and by extension, domestic and family violence. And then that really set the trajectory for the next couple of positions that I moved into. I spent some time at the Commonwealth Ombudsman, which looks at government departments from the outside in and analyses whether they're acting in fair and just ways. And I also had a real turning point when I managed Elsie Women's Refuge for a year about a decade ago. And that was the real culmination of seeing all of the systemic disadvantages that women and children face, you know, abuse, isolation, alienation, being cut off from resources and support. You see it right in front of you. You know, your office is effectively in somebody else's home, and the women and the children are presenting there with problems that are immediate and their needs are critical. And so you don't have the option to look away or put the phone down or not answer the email. You know, it is right there and you need to do something. And one of the things that always spurred me with that was the fact that, you know, we might have a woman and her children leave one afternoon, and then my staff would get the room ready for the next family, and then the next morning there would be 3 urgent requests for that one bed. And you know, and all of them had stories as deeply shocking and concerning as you can possibly imagine. And all of them really needed that place. And so you essentially had to make a very difficult choice every day. And I couldn't believe that in 2011 Australia, as it was then, that there weren't enough safe beds for women and children who needed them. And that really propelled me towards my journey of you know, a couple of years later, I was in the public service and I had to make a very big choice. You know, I had this really assured career trajectory and track with a lot of nice benefits, or I could junk it all and join a startup charity with no guarantees of success and see if I could bring this urgent issue to broader attention. And that's the path I chose.
Well, there's undoubtedly many thousands of families who thank you for not being a lawyer, as noble as the profession of law is, and following your passion. Can I just come back a moment to reflect on that, what must be an agonizing decision when you have one bed and you have 3 women with equal need? How do you make a decision in a moment like that? How do you choose?
Let me tell you about the day that really highlighted that. So I'd been out at a meeting in the morning. You know, I'd gone at about 9:30 and I came back to the shelter at about 11. And there were 3 clipboards sitting on the table, women who all needed that room. And the circumstances were, the first one was the local police station had rung, and they had a young Aboriginal mother down there who was about 22, and she had 3 kids with her. And they were desperately looking for somewhere for her to go because she'd been physically assaulted, and she couldn't go home because there was domestic violence there. And so, you know, they were advocating for her to have that bed. The second call was from the social worker at the Royal Prince Alfred Hospital, who said, we've got a mum here and she delivered premature twins 6 weeks ago. Now, we're going to have to take the babies away from her if we can't find somewhere safe to place her with those babies where she'll get support, because there's domestic violence in the home. And she'd already had a number of other children removed from her care. So this was her last chance to actually keep those children with her. And the third call was from a mother who had been living in a car over the weekend with her 2 teenage children because they'd had to get out of the house. And she had said to us, I'm going to put our last $30 in the world in petrol into the car if I can drive up and come and stay in that room. So those are the kinds of choices that you had to make. And in that situation, what we did was we gave priority to the mum coming out of hospital with the babies, and she ended up staying with us for a long time. We also knew that there was likely a room coming up in the shelter within the next couple of days. So we actually put the young Aboriginal mum into a hotel nearby and supported her by visiting her for the next couple of days. And for the mum in Wollongong, we actually rang around on her behalf and were able to find a place that hadn't been put out to the network yet to enable her somewhere safely to go. And that is the kind of minor miracle that you pull off every single day when you work in a women's shelter.
That sounds like undoubtedly a life-changing result for those three women. I imagine there's also a number of moments where women need to be turned away because you simply don't have the space. What keeps you going in those moments, and how do you get through it? And who supports you when you keep hearing these stories, which must often feel particularly heartbreaking?
Look, I think for me, getting upset about it achieves nothing for anyone. And so it is much better to actually turn, to use the emotions that you feel around it as fuel for the fire to make some change. Because what you know, and certainly my approach when working to establish women's community shelters is the acknowledgement that you can't, it's a bit like the starfish metaphor. There's a story that, there's a young girl who's walking along the beach after a storm, and the storm is the beach is covered in starfish. And every now and then she picks one up and she puts it back into the sea. And then she walks a bit further and puts one back into the sea. And, and she confronts somebody walking in the other direction. They say to her, well, why are you doing that? You can't save all of them. And she says, but boy, I made a difference to this one and to this one and to this one. And so it's about acknowledging that you are never going to be able to do the whole job. But if you start small and you do what you can where you are with what you have, then it has a multiplier effect. You bring more people to the mission, and then you start somewhere else, and you build that capacity and you start somewhere else. And over time, that actually adds up to an extraordinary amount of help for a lot of people. And so I talk about working with patient urgency. The issue is urgent, but we have to be patient and thoughtful in the way that we address it so people do get the care that they need.
And of course, the ripple effect on their lives and on their families and on their children in being able to access the shelter in that moment is life-changing. And often you can't know those downstream effects. It actually brings to mind, I know it's obviously a very dramatic example in a different time, but when Schindler decided to save as many Jews as he could, and he just took under his wing and he hid and he protected as many families as he could. And then the grandchildren now of those survivors who are alive, who wouldn't have been alive if not for him making that decision to make that difference. And so it's extraordinary work, which is undoubtedly changing and saving lives as well, given the urgency of the work that you do. So Women's Community Shelters has been an ICOChange partner from very early on, and we'll talk more shortly about some of the direct impact that the funding raised is having. Could you just perhaps share sort of top level, structurally, how many shelters are there, where you're operating, and how that process works? I understand these are safe houses. They're anonymous for good reason. Could you share from an operational perspective how that works?
Right. So Women's Community Shelters, we work a little bit like a hub and spokes. So Women's Community Shelters is the head office hub, and we do all of the development work of finding those communities to establish new shelters, working with local communities to bring them to life, help fund their operations, help fund the right people to be involved, and have a what you'd call in business, I guess, a critical path from point A to point B in delivering a shelter to a local community. And so we currently have worked with 9 communities around New South Wales, and I'm really delighted that in the week of International Women's Day, we're opening shelter number 9, which is Blue Wren House in Camden. But we have shelters all over Greater Sydney, and one on the Mid-North Coast as well. We also have a range of other activities around that. When we started doing this and establishing these new shelters as local entities, we thought what we were doing was establishing new crisis accommodation in partnership with communities. But what we quickly discovered was that we're actually taking communities on a whole journey of understanding domestic and family violence and what everybody can do to address it. And so around that, we've built additional programs of community education, walk the talk high schools, respectful relationships and consent education, asking kids to support their local shelter for a year as part of that. And we also provide the all-important next stage of housing for women once they leave our shelters, and make sure that they stay on the path to, to recovery and re-entry back into life through ongoing outreach support. And so really, if you were looking at things through a health lens, you're moving all the way from what we'd call primary prevention through to early intervention, crisis response and recovery. And it's really important that we do all of those things with community. And so a shelter can accommodate around 5 or 6 women and their children at any one time. And that's because we like the shelters to feel like a home. Any bigger and you start to get a bit institutional. And we provide casework support, connections to community, referrals to anybody that the women and children need to see, doctors, lawyers, counsellors, immigration officers. We liaise with school principals. We make sure the kids have fun school holidays. And women and children generally stay around 3 months in each of our shelters and then move on to the next stage of housing.
So it seems that, this is an ancient issue and a complex issue. The structures, the ideologies, to some extent, the religious beliefs, the cultural beliefs that underpin violence against women. To what extent would you say inequality is the foundation that leads to domestic and family violence?
Yeah, I think it absolutely is. And I think it's been that way since time immemorial. Women have always been the ones who carry the lion's share of domestic work, of child rearing, of caring for, elderly and family members, and giving of their time in a volunteer capacity and in a way that really isn't valued by, what you might say are market-driven societies. It's this whole stream of care work and looking after others that just goes uncounted, and that's been built in forever. And I think so there's lots of elements that lead into this, and I think fundamentally disrespect for women and a lack of acknowledgement of that contribution has some very deep roots in ultimately causing violence against women.
Do you believe it's possible that one day violence against women could become a thing of the past? And what would it take to achieve this?
I think it absolutely could be. I'm an optimist. Even after years of working in the space, I'm an optimist about the fact that this is actually a wicked social problem that we can solve. Will it take a lot of concerted effort? Absolutely. And I think we're starting to have the conversation, certainly in Australia, that we need to have about what it takes to shift those attitudes and to change things. But I also think we need to be under no illusions that we can never consider this work done once and for all. It will always be, there will always be work to be done. There will always be elements of inequality. There will always be people who seek to take advantage of others to fulfill their own needs, or to seek to use others rather than treat them with respect. And so we are going to have an ongoing project, so to speak. And the other thing I think is that we can see that if we don't keep this project moving forward, it's very easy for things to slip back. I was reading yesterday that it's 519 days since the Taliban in Afghanistan took away the right for women and girls to attend education. And that is how easy it is for things to slip back if we don't remain eternally vigilant on this issue, because it is a very easy, it's a very easy trap to fall into, is that if you exclude half of a population from education, opportunities and self-actualization, then you're already preferencing a particular group to the front, aren't you? So I think eternal vigilance will be required to eliminate and to keep it eliminated.
I always think the elephant in the room in these conversations is that we actually don't call this what it is, which is almost exclusively men's violence against women. You know, this sort of moniker of family and domestic violence, you know, it's not the dog biting the man's ankle. It's the man in the household, a current or former partner, almost exclusively, not to say it doesn't happen otherwise, choosing to use violence against his current or former wife or partner and children. And 1 in 3 women in this country will experience it, as you know well, and approximately 1 woman per week is killed by her current or former partner. Why don't we call it what it is in the sector? And wouldn't it be helpful to do so? Because if we can't name it, we can't address it for what it is. And what are your thoughts on not actually, I mean, given how urgent this issue is and how damaging it is, why are we not able to actually call it for what it is?
I think that's a really interesting question. And I certainly think that the tide is turning in terms of naming it for what it is and calling it male violence against women and children. I have been on the internet since the earliest days of the internet. You know, it's sort of, it's been around since I was in my early 20s. If you, even 10, 15 years ago, if you called male violence against women on the internet as a woman, the amount of vitriol, abuse, doxing, payback that you would encounter just for being a woman in a public space, for example, on the internet, was extraordinary. And so I think there's, in terms of calling it what it is, up until quite recently, there's been a level of self-protection around that. You know, it actually has been over time quite scary to advocate as a feminist and supporting women in this space, because the amount of abuse that you cop for calling it what it is, for calling it very plainly what it is, draws particular fringe elements out of the woodwork who will come for you. And so in order for the public square and for women to be in a position, and for male champions to call this what it is, we have to work to create those spaces where it is safe to call it for what it is. Because, you know, nobody wants to go through personal situations where they've had photographs of their front door shared with them, or, you know, and sent to them as a threat, you know, like, I know where you live. And this is something that routinely used to happen, even up until sort of 5-10 years ago. And I think it is the collection of voices and the building of advocacy and the fact that there is a much stronger worldwide movement around naming this for what it is that is actually going to help us change our language in the next 5 to 10 years. And we have to, because you cannot change what you don't acknowledge. You know, when we read headlines saying a woman was killed, you know, or woman killed in knife murder. Well, it wasn't the knife that murdered her, and it wasn't a passive act. It was somebody making a choice to use a weapon to violently kill her. And that person was statistically likely to be a man and a current or former partner.
And even in naming the woman, and not even that the man existed in that, creating that outcome, there's a degree of victim blaming.
Absolutely.
That somehow she still remains responsible. I mean, I felt it's heartening to see the extent to which the definitions of masculinity are beginning to become understood to play a very key role. You know, obviously the word toxic, that phrase, toxic masculinity, has become prevalent globally. And, you know, let it be a challenge to men, I believe, because we do need to look at the cultural and social conditions and everything that's happened to us from the moment of birth, which defines what we believe being a man looks like, which does need significant redefining in really every country in the world. I mean, to some places more than others. And, you know, I note we work with Hunter Johnson, for example, from the Man Cave, you know, working systematically, going out to schools to engage young men to on the fairly accurate assumption that mostly they don't see at home reflected back to them respectful relationships. And so taking it to schools, and at that really critical point where there's a lot of hormones in play, and often, if it's a single-sex school, they don't get to interact with girls as friends, so the sexualization becomes really complete in those early days. So, I just want to touch briefly, because Me Too was this global cultural inflection point, which continues to shape how men behave at home and in the workplace. And I always thought it was interesting because some men subsequently responded with this frustration, asking, "Oh, well, how am I meant to behave? What is appropriate, right?" And it's really as simple as, my response is just understand your intention, right? When you're connecting with a woman, if you do so with the respect and dignity as you would any human being, seeking to be her friend, there's a very high chance, she's not going to have any sort of negative response to you if you approach her with that intentionality. Why do you believe this continues to be such a challenging issue for men around the world, which, the likes of people like Andrew Tate can so readily exploit? It's sort of a seething anger. It's an insecurity. It's still tapping into this ancient belief that somehow women owe them something. They owe them sexual favors. They owe them their attention. They owe them time. That seems to be a very compelling narrative, especially for young men. How do you believe we tackle that at the coalface and redefine? Because you and I might be having this conversation again 50 years from now, unless we tackle, right? We don't have 50 years, right? Unless we tackle the root causes of sexism and misogyny. What do you think would form part of the answer or key answer to that?
Well, I think it's a lot. It goes to a lot, and there's a very compelling writer in the space called Lundy Bancroft, and he started off in the 1980s in America doing men's behaviour change programs, and he did that for about 30 years. And so he was working with, people who chose to use abuse and who had been either self-referred to these programs or mandated, often through the criminal justice system. And the way that he thinks about it is to talk about, like if you're thinking about it like a tree, you have the roots, which are the values and beliefs which underpin where somebody's coming from. And then you've got the trunk of the tree, which is this sense of entitlement that grows out of that. And then you've got the branches, which manifest in things like misogyny or control or or disrespect. All of those things are the elements of that. So I think what we've got to get down to is right down to those that values and belief system that might drive people to think that they are entitled to act in these particular ways. And that's really what we've got to chip into in terms of respect and recognizing that women are, full humans in their own right, with a narrative of their own desires, lives, aspirations, and self-actualization that they want to achieve, just like anybody else. And that it is a respect and a recognition of that, rather than an objectification, which actually leads to better relationships overall, which is why I think the education piece for young people is as critical as possible, and why we do programs like our Walk the Talk in high schools. Although ideally, I think you'd be getting people almost prenatally, to start that trajectory towards learning. But I think all of those things are really important. I also think that, we need to think that a lot of people feel alienated, disconnected, dispossessed. And in that kind of environment, it's very, very easy to get sucked into all kinds of crazy beliefs, be that misogyny and the incel community, and, thinking that women are the cause of all of the problems in your life, or that, the deep state is, it's very easy for humans who feel isolated and disconnected to fall into logical traps and ways of thinking and acting that are complete solutions. And as we know, life is complicated, life is complex, it's not easily understood, and there's much in the grey areas. And so what we've got to do is just give people those tools as early as possible to educate them about how respectful relationships work, about how to navigate the world. And also, we need to focus on building social cohesion and connection so that people don't feel isolated or left behind.
Annabelle, I noticed the time, and you and I could talk about this for a long time. You are a depth of knowledge in this space. Just to sort of bring this back to what this work means to you, what do you look forward to most every day? And also, if I could ask you to share, when you get to the end of your life, and hopefully it's many, many years from now, what do you believe you'll feel most proud of looking back upon your professional career?
Yeah, I think the thing that gets me through every day is, you know, when I put my head on the pillow at the end of each day, I go to sleep knowing that there are more than 200 women and children who are sleeping safer because of the work that Women's Community Shelters does. And that is something that is tangible and real, and that makes a difference for that many people each day, which is what keeps me optimistic about being able to do so much more, and about wanting the next decade to be able to, you know, create another 40,000 safe bed nights every year over the course of the next decade. And look, the things that motivate me, every day is different. We have, you know, the way that we work is we have the latitude to explore new partnerships and to be innovative and to, you know, work with people who are values aligned to bring about solutions which benefit women and children. And I think, you know, one of the things about the domestic and family violence space is that historically it's been very reluctant to take any kind of risk, because safety is our first principle and our organising principle. That is the way that we work with women and children. And obviously that's front of mind. But when it comes to solving wicked social problems, we simply have to take risks. We have to put ourselves out there. We have to think innovatively. We have to work in new partnerships and new ways, because the alternative is having to be that shelter manager that turns away 2 out of 3 requests. And I never want to go back there.
So I know we're very proud at I Could Change to have raised over $1.36 million and counting to support the work of women's community shelters. Could you share the impact of those funds, where it's being deployed and how it's helping to change lives?
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. And you can, you know, you can count that in so many different ways. And I think first and foremost, that amount of money would support our head office hub for a whole year to enable us to work with those new communities, to establish new shelters. So what that really does is gives us that all important capacity to get out there and to be able to say yes to the communities that approach us for help. You know, the other thing that $1.3 million does is it funds our entire shelter network with our contribution to their costs for a whole year. So, you know, that is, again, 40,000 safe bed nights for women and children. How many lives changed is that kind of impact? So the way that people give through the I Equals Change platform, it only takes a couple of minutes, but boy, oh boy, it makes an extraordinary difference for women's community shelters and the women and children that we support in our shelters. You know, $50 buys a night of safety for a woman and her family. And that is often the key turning point that is the first step in a new life, and that can't be underestimated.
I must say that actually the work that you do has been the most chosen project so far, and it's really telling, right? Because if 1 in 3 women experience at some point physical or sexual violence, then most people know someone, right, who has been impacted, and therefore it's symbolic of how much, sadly, so many Australians can relate to this issue, know in their family or have someone in their friendship circle who has been directly impacted by violence or sexual abuse. What's been interesting from I Could Change, we're working we make it simple for retailers to give back from every sale. It's so interesting that we have more and more case studies showing that actually people will complete their purchase more when they know that the brand gives back, when they know that that brand is committed to being a force for good. And in some cases, it's driving growth, driving those conversions for online businesses higher than when they do discounts, which I think is represents a fascinating shift in our psychology around, it's not just about chasing the best deal, but actually all of us wanting to shop for good, to shop for change, to know that our purchase is contributing to something or to someone experiencing something bigger than ourselves, to want to be that agent for change. Which brings me to Shop for Change, which is coming up on International Women's Day, which is effectively that campaign where retailers are invited to increase their giving from $1 to $3 per sale for 3 days, and to be able to feature the incredible work that you're doing at Women's Community Shelters and our other NGO partners. So this is really a powerful moment for businesses to come on board. They can just come on even for the Shop for Change campaign for International Women's Day for 3 days and see the impact that it has on their business. We kind of straddle this interesting world, bridging worlds between businesses and incredible NGOs such as yourselves. And I think there's so much power in us bringing these conversations together. There's incredible stories and lives being changed through the work you're doing. And at the same time, businesses run by people just like all of us. You know, we all care about something, right? And we all want to both work in businesses that are building a better world and build businesses that are contributing to building a better world in this uniquely fragile time. I'd like to put it out to if there's any questions from the audience to Annabelle. This would be the moment if you'd like to, any particular questions come to mind. Thanks, Melanie. Annabelle, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, look, I think, and Melanie makes an incredibly important point, and I think what we're talking about when we're talking about male violence against women and children is a shorthand, and I want to really acknowledge that violence does obviously exist in LGBTIQ communities as well, and it requires specialised responses, and that also pets are very often used as the victims, are very often the victims of domestic and family violence, and a particularly cruel form of abuse, which is threats to pets or actual harm as part of a coercive, controlling or abusive relationship. And I think when I talk about, you know, and Jeremy, when you talk about calling male violence against women and children, I think what we're talking about is the statistically most significant part of abuse. It doesn't exclude those other forms, but I think if we can get comfortable with calling out what is the main statistic kind of gendered violence, which is male violence against women and children, then we can have that more nuanced conversation with people as societal education increases about those other aspects. That doesn't mean that we're ignoring them or failing to address them. I acknowledge that they're really important, and certainly we address them as part of the work of women's community shelters as well.
Yeah, thanks, Annabelle. Thanks, Melanie. That's a very important question. Any others? Thanks, Alexei. Annabelle.
Oh, look, and that's just such a terrific question, Alexei. I think have the open conversations. I think, you know, it can be as simple as I remember a few years ago when I had a partner who had 2 children from a previous marriage, and we were watching television commercials. You know, this would have even been in the 90s or the early 2000s. And it was about, like, that was a time when there was still some really sexist stereotypes in, you know, in television advertising that we'd see. You know, it's like washing detergents, always pitched towards women, very stereotypical, very stereotypical depictions. They used to really annoy me. I used to call those out all the time and say to the kids, see, what's that ad telling you about what's women's responsibility? Or, you know, all of those kinds of things. There are so many teachable moments that come up every day with kids. I think it's also worthwhile learning from your kids' schools what programs they actually have around this and how early that they address them, and to just really discuss this, you know, discuss this issue in positive terms and openly in an age-appropriate way. And I also think that catching kids doing positive things is a terrific reinforcement for the behaviour that we want to see in terms of treating other people with respect as a base principle.
Such an important question. From LinkedIn.
Mm-hmm. The way that it's worked in terms of, then the question is for those who can't read it, how do you choose a shelter? Do you approach a community or do they approach you? And the answer is over time, there's been a little bit of both. In the early days, when we were establishing our first shelters, I kind of looked for the signs of what you might describe as ripeness within a community. There were some key local champions on the ground that were interested in the issues of domestic and family violence or homelessness, that there was an unmet need, that there were women in the community who were approaching crisis accommodation services and being turned away, or that there were none there. And what's more, that there was a willingness and an initiative to do something about it, and that we, as women's community shelters, would provide the backbone to make that happen. And to this day, it is now more about communities approaching us, seeing that the model's been proven 9 times over, seeing the scale of what we've been able to achieve, and also that we've improved how we do it over time. This has been a real learning experience for us in terms of the support that we provide and how we work out how that path goes. And so, yet mixed, but overwhelmingly these days, it's approaches from local communities, and they come from all over Australia.
Thanks for that. Any further questions? Lewis, thank you for that. What is your biggest shelter? How many women would be in a shelter at one time?
We try not to do too big, and that's a policy decision, because like many of our shelters will accommodate around 5 or 6 women and their children at any one time. And that's because, as I mentioned earlier, we don't want them to get too big, because they get institutional, and that number for us is about right. So it still feels like a home, and we can provide the level of professional support at the intensity that's needed when you're in a crisis situation. We have some shelters that provide support for 10 women. They might not have children with them. And we're also in the process of expanding our shelters, some of our shelters, into a second site so they can provide specialised support. And doing it that way is really important to us. We want to get the balance right between dignity, community, privacy, and engagement wherever possible, so that people feel that they've got enough of each, enough independence, enough community, and enough support to be able to take their next steps.
Thanks, Lewis. Thank you. There's a lovely comment, such powerful work. There's a lot of other questions, but I'm afraid we've actually run out of time. This is a topic that many people are passionate about, and if not directly impacted by. Annabelle, it's such an honour to really hear from you, to learn from you, to listen to the deep expertise which you obviously have for this issue over the years. And I'm often in awe of speaking to people like yourself who bring a deep passion and intelligence and commitment to helping, as you say, make a dent in the universe on such a critical issue. And to me, and I know for our team, you and the team you work with really are the heroes that we should be celebrating these days, understanding the complexity of the issue and again, that deep commitment required to help people at their most vulnerable time. So keep on doing the incredible work, as I know you will. And we are at I Could Change, we partner with NGOs really for the long term, wanting to provide that long-term sustainable funding so you can do more of that life-changing work that you do. Thank you so much for your time, Annabelle, and really an honour. Keep up the great work, and congrats again on the 10-year anniversary.
Thank you.
I hope there was a birthday cake of some description. And
I'm hoping there will be at some point. That would be lovely.
Okay, well, the end of the week is coming, so that's a nod to the team. There should be a cake on Friday for Annabelle. Thanks, everyone. We'll have International Women's Days coming up soon, and we'll be letting everyone know about the next Impact Series webinar with another extraordinary NGO leader. Have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you.